Welcome to the I podcast. This is your host, Jack Gaines. I is a product of the Civil Affairs Association and brings in people who are current or former military, diplomats, development officers, and field agents to discuss their experiences on ground with the partner nation's people and leadership. Our goal is to inspire anyone interested in working the last 3 feet of foreign relations. To contact the show, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com or look us up on the Civil Affairs Association website at www.civilaffairsassoc.org. I'll have those in the show notes.
I often tell people that if you take essentially information warfare, political warfare, lawfare, marketing, and social sciences and blend it all up, you're scratching PSYOP.
Today, we welcome back retired Colonel Robert Curris for the second half of his discussion on the opinion piece, "The Army Needs to Invest in Psychological Operations and Not Cut Them." If you have not heard the first half, I recommend checking it out. But either way, let's get on with the show.
We've talked about the culture inside of PSYOP and the training that we think PSYOP needs and how we grow that force and grow that capability. I would like to point out, going back to part of what the start of this conversation was, with the battalions moving up under SF, it will, in fact, help with RSOF integration. I have no doubt about that. And there will be a unity of command. My problem with it goes back to as you do that, you will lose in the RAND study from about 5 or 6 years ago that talked about this exact example of RSOF integration. That's where this came from. Mm-hmm. In that RAND study, it directly said this will improve integration, but it will disrupt, the culture of the branch and also the proficiencies of the branch, because at that point, you've got the highest ranking guy you have is lieutenant colonel trying to determine everything that he needs to train his forces on. And At that point, he's being evaluated by a special forces officer who may not agree with that. Right. And that you could lose some core capabilities in the process of this integration, and certainly your branch identity. And I think that is not worth the integration here, because there's been a lot made of the lack of our operational integrity over the past few years, but I don't think any of it rises to the surface of essentially destroying potentially 2 branches, being PSYOP and civil affairs.
Right.
And I've got, some friends who are also retired peers of mine, and sometimes they like to say, if they want the people, they should take the mission, because they will quickly find out the mission is not as easy as people think, because we do have to deal with a separate set of authorities that isn't just in a basic operations order or an execution order. Right. We have to really navigate separate approval processes, which can be a little bit arduous.
And incredibly complex approval process.
And so at that point, if you're putting all that on a special forces colonel, who's also trying to, manage 4 or 5 battalions worth of his own people.
Right.
Now you're talking 6 to 7 battalions, depending if they keep the support battalion in the group. So at that point, you're talking 7 battalions. And, even if they're the best one, the smartest guy, the right guy at the right place, that's a scope of management. And especially when you start getting into, the other MOS's capabilities that must be trained that he may not even realize. I commanded our 3rd PSYOP battalion, which had just as many public affairs and signaliers and other MOSs as it did cypers. And
sounds like a bag of cats, man. I bet that was something else.
It was. I think I had something like 26 or 27 different MOSs.
Wow.
Inside my battalion in fairly.
Was that kind of an old version of information warfare? Is that what they were trying to do?
Well, no, it was meant to be global support to all the regional battalions, because it provided the radio broadcast platforms, the TV broadcast platforms, the editing suites, the print media, all of it. Image capture and video capture, and all the stuff that supports the making and creating of a PSYOP product.
Sure.
Mostly came from outside of PSYOP, right? So you had 25 mics and Victors, and a lot of those MOSs no longer exist because they've consolidated over time. But so a lot of signal, a lot of PA. We actually had actual PAO billets to help us with writing copy and things like that. And but
it makes sense because public affairs creates a lot of great content. That,
it does,
and it's verifiable. It's got sources, so it makes it easier for a PSYOPer to take that and send it out to channels that PA doesn't have in order to forward the mission. It's great.
Yeah, 100%. But what you quickly learn as the leader of that organization is that you were constantly reaching out to either the Signal Schoolhouse or to DINFOS, the DoD's information school in Maryland, were quintessential into letting me know the jobs and the tasks and the things that I needed to keep my people trained on, so that when they went back to their core MOS, they were still competitive for promotion. They were still competitive in terms of core skill sets, that they, were able to keep up with a peer that wasn't with us, right? That was still in their main branch. And so just that one example is a microcosm with, I forget how many people I had. I think it was like almost a 700-man battalion at the time. Mm-hmm. But trying to keep up with that many branches to go, okay, how do we use their skill set to our advantage, but not destroy them in the process? Right. Keep them competitive, keep them, engaged with their home branches and their home schools, keep them up to date on the training that they needed to be competitive with their peer sets in their normal units. And if you didn't take the time to do that, you could easily burn people left and right, and they wouldn't be making the higher, NCO grades or even, the officers. So for instance, signal officers were one case where I had platoon leader slots for them, but there wasn't really anywhere for them to grow into a captain's billet unless it was just a normal S6 position, like a normal signal position on the battalion headquarters staff. So working with other soft units who had captain's level billets so that we could say, okay, this officer's coming up on a time where I really need to transition him or her to this next job to keep them competitive in the signal branch. Right. Those kind of conversations have to happen. I am concerned that as we push out an entire battalion, and in your case, Civil Affairs is doing the same thing at the same time, and expanding the span of control of another 06, guy, regardless of branch, but just an 06 period, you're giving them 7 battalions. That's just a lot to manage. And I'm not for sure that they will take the time that is required to ensure that they're up to date on what's the latest PSYOP doctrine, what are the things we're competing with, what is their responsibility to make sure in terms of time or training and management or dollars or our facilities that we have to be able to go and do. And it's just a lot. And it would be a lot for any 06. It sounds like I'm bagging on SF there, but I'm really just saying,
you're asking for a lot by doing this, guys. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I just say, and I think it's bad for everybody. I think the level of integration that you get at truly the tactical level isn't worth the risk that you're creating. Right. And another example would be, when we deploy our teams, and especially our teams who are doing military support and public diplomacy, they go work in embassies, et cetera. And they are under the purview of the Theater Special Operations Command. And so when, anytime an SF group deploys, they're under the TSOC as well, kind of thing, but they have their own mission and their own focus.
Yeah.
We might have 20 nodes in a combatant command region out there, and, maybe 2/3 of them will be co-located with a special forces unit. But most of them aren't, or portions of them aren't. And they're working through the public diplomacy office in an embassy, or other type things, or working directly with a unit potentially, and so that is what we had always sort of referred to as the theater strategic reach. That's what when people were talking about gray zones, and especially in countries that were on the bubble in terms of conflict or different things.
Right.
It was, DOD personnel working out of an embassy to shore up different portions of that team, of that country team kind of thing. There's a potential that a lot of that goes away, and that will become a problem.
Well, there's already been a struggle with PSYOP and being in embassies. The numbers of PSYOPs working public diplomacy has shrunk in recent years, hasn't it?
It has, but it has because going back to the mutual respect, most of the Special Forces leadership has not valued that mission because it potentially took bodies off the table that could be on a next tactical rotation or next CJTF, Combined Joint Task Force Headquarters rotation.
So do we need to use more reservists in those positions then? Because I know State Department values having those folks there.
I think I know we have successfully done that twice that I'm aware of. I think it's one of those things where they would inherit a particular mission and then they would just continue to rotate on that one mission because, as you're aware, in the reserve force, it's hard to generate the power. So it would have to be one of those things where the command would say, okay, we did this with a naval headquarters that I won't mention completely by name, but there was a naval headquarters that required a PSYOP team, and they got too much for active duty PSYOP to fill it. The reserves took it on as a rotation, and they still own it to this day, I believe. And they did a great job because at that point, anything that was deficient in their original training could be made up for in the pre-mission training.
Right.
Because those positions are mostly planners. So, they would go to the joint planning courses and get qualified to be able to do that level of planning. And I think they did a great job, at least during the time period that I commanded a task force and worked with them. I thought they did a great job.
Yeah, usually when I saw MIST teams, military information support teams at the embassy, they were working grant programs where the local nationals were doing the actual outreach and messaging to the population. And then they were just making sure they got paid and that they were staying on the focus, on the goal.
Yeah, I mean, that one really does vary by country. I mean, we've had, and it really comes down to how risk averse or not an ambassador is and what they want to do. At the low end, we've had ambassadors who only wanted us to do community outreach, which frankly would have fallen more into your category of work in civil affairs. And then we've had other ones that were, especially when there was a lot of counterterrorism dollars and they were in countries that had issues, they were all about us getting after some more hardcore, influence capabilities. And we were happy to do that. And because that's really where we find our niche. And that goes back to your comment back when we were talking recruiting about what we can and can't talk about. I mean, we have some great examples that are all at the tactical level that we talk about quite often of our successes. But some of our higher end stuff where we might have used cutouts or there might have been, special orders where we used different pots of money and different things like that, which was all legal. I mean, you had to get it all approved. Right. But a lot of that is still not stuff that we can really, give the concrete example of. We can talk about it in the ether space, but not really give examples. But it makes it difficult. And everybody has their own version of what they think we are or ought to be. Yeah.
Well, we've hit 45 minutes, and I'd like to get your opinion on what do you think PSYOP should do? What's the next steps for both the active duty and the reserve side? Because as Special Forces has brought the PSYOP groups under the battalions, the UCKPOC has brought the POGs underneath the Civil Affairs Commands, which is good and bad, in my opinion. It's good because it gives the POGs a larger support base, and it gives them a public affairs officer so that they can speak to the public. But the bad is they're not independent, and they, are going to have to struggle with the same issues that the active duty folks are going to have.
Right. So this is the part where I normally get a little bit controversial and say, I truly believe that there should be something akin to the Joint Special Operations Command for information. I believe there should be a Joint Information Command, or which would include influence and PSYOP specifically. And I think that's where PSYOP belongs. I think if we're going to ever be allowed, and I use that word specifically, if we're ever going to be allowed to go beyond tactical or even maybe theater strategic, maybe, that it can't be under USASOC in the form it is now. We need to move up to joint, and in so doing, reform what used to be, and I mentioned it earlier, the MISOC, the Military Information Support Command. I would probably change the name back to just PSYOP Command at this point, and bring all those units back together. And it's kind of akin to people didn't learn their lesson when they got rid of DIVARTIs and pushed out all the artillery battalions to the infantry brigades.
Right.
And having been a former fire support officer and having done that, and I was a prior enlisted 11 Bravo in the National Guard. So like, I understood the infantry mentality, I understood the artillery mentality, but at the end of the day, we were never going to have the same training benefits as we would consolidated at the battalion and DIVARTI level. And ironically, they brought the DIVARTI back because they were like, hey, this isn't working. The idea of using the DIVARTI headquarters, Division Artillery Headquarters, as only a fire support coordination headquarters was great, but you saw an atrophy of the core skill sets of the artillerymen. And this is going to be the exact same way.
Okay.
They're getting rid of the one PSYOP group, getting rid of it completely, and then they're going to say that they're going to use the other group as a DIVARTI-like headquarters to do personnel management and that kind of thing. But, as an experiment, this has already failed once.
Yeah. Well, that takes two groups out.
Yeah. Well,
because if you dissolve one and use the other one for admin, you've taken out two groups.
Yeah, 100%. And on top of that, when you look at one of the biggest points internal to the PSYOP community was always the training deficit between the reserves and the active duty, because they had so many training days and training dollars, and they were not allowed to do our full, essentially 9-month course, right, because they could only go so far. But that could be made up to a degree with station training if it was controlled in a controlled manner, right? You could get them caught up. And it's not to say that they're not good PSYOPers, because there's some phenomenal PSYOPers on the reserve side that I've worked with, a million times, and I do it all again tomorrow. But when you talk about the formal training, so that you have the ability to justify why you are as a unit or as a branch doing something or not doing something,
right?
It often comes back to those core tasks, which are the training piece. So I still contend that if we were consolidated as a force, both reserve and active duty, you could always delineate some of the mission sets based on the training piece, and you could overcome some of what I think have been bad decisions for our branch from other, because they were made by people from other branches, by putting it in a joint environment where it forces everybody to sort of go, okay, if we're bringing everybody in, because the Marine Corps has a very successful PSYOP organization right now. They actually deleted a tank battalion in order to create their PSYOP force. And they go through our schoolhouse. So they made a decision as a force to get rid of some pointy end of the spear guys in order to create influence guys. And they go through our schoolhouse. They have instructors at our schoolhouse. It's not labeled as such, but we truly have a joint training environment there between us and the Marine Corps. And the Navy has sent multiple people through our training, as well as they've started to expand back their influence capabilities. That's less formal at this point. And then, as I think you probably know, the Air Force stood up what I think is called the 16th Squadron or Wing, which is, has their social scientists and their version of PSYOP in there as well, or influence. And if we got all of that together in an organization that was responsive to the nation, the same way that the JSOC is, Joint Special Operations Command, we could do so much more.
Yeah.
And not only do so much more, but not lose the skill sets to provide that tactical support that the Marine Corps and Special Forces and the regular Army desperately needs.
Right. It sounds like other branches or other services are taking information more seriously.
Oh, there's been a huge investment everywhere but our SOF. And like I said, the Marine Corps cut a tank battalion. The Navy stood up a wing, or not the Navy, the Air Force did. The Navy started to expand their programs, and all that was going on at the exact same time that they were standing up Cyber Command and trying to figure out what they were going to do with the Information Operations Force, which they still haven't completely figured out, and the Electronic Warfare Force. I mean, if there was ever a group of people that ought to be working together at a national level, it's all of that.
Right.
But you can't do that if you're working for a colonel.
You just don't have the punch.
Yeah. I mean, and don't get me wrong. I mean, so when I was a group commander, 90% of the SF group commanders, we had very professional relationships, made some great friends during that time period. There's always an overlap for who's in their first year, second year, and all that kind of stuff. And some hugely capable human beings. Absolutely. But, at the end of the day, they're still a colonel, and they can only take things so far. And especially if they deploy, they're most likely deploying on a tactical mission set and not regional. And then when you look at the people in how the Army runs processes, we haven't had an active duty general officer in a position to make just good decisions for our branch in 50 years. And we've suffered because of it. And I'm not just, a lot of people ding us on that because they're like, you're just crying because you don't have a guy with a star, guy or gal. And I'm like, it's not just the star.
It's the level of influence.
It's the level of influence, and frankly, and it reverses, it's having somebody on the blame line. If our forces in the Special Warfare Center and school are not training PSYOPers to be good PSYOPers, there should be a PSYOP general that's at fault and should be held accountable. The same thing's true for the operational force. If we're not mission ready, if we don't have our guys and gals ready to go out the door and do their mission right and do a good job at it, there should be a PSYOP general that's held accountable for that lack of, capability. And right now, we've had a lot of lack of training capability. We've had a lot of lack of operational capability, but no one's holding the Special Forces general officers accountable for that, even though they were the ones making the decisions.
Yeah.
Right. And so it gets frustrating because I go back to a colonel can only do so much. So when we still had commandants, and I was the last PSYOP commandant when we had them, even as the commandant, I could only push things so far as a colonel. And without the general officers, essentially going, okay, Bob, we'll do that.
Right.
But if it was in any way counter to what they wanted to do, it didn't happen. But at that point, was it my fault that it didn't happen or his fault?
Right. Now, at the strategic national level, does PSYOP have a alum force that lobbies for them?
No, not.
Have they considered building a civilian alumni that lobbies for them?
Yeah, well, I think you're talking to it.
Oh, okay.
So when
you're the Army of One, I remember that ad.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
I took the commercial seriously. But honestly, what it came down to, there's so much of our alumni force that are still working for the government.
Sure.
That when the initial rumblings of these decisions of potentially dissolving 8th Group and the 9th Battalion headquarters and 3rd Battalion, as well as moving the regional battalions underneath the SF groups, was all coming out, there was no one else really in a position to be able to talk about it publicly and not put themselves in jeopardy. And so,
but there's got to be PSYOPers that are out there that are no longer working for the government, but are involved in the Beltway or other areas of value, like in the corporate world, that could lend a hand or a voice to supporting the PSYOP cause. It just has not organized yet.
Correct. And I agree with you. I tell you what's interesting. And so this is where, once again, the Special Forces do a great job of this. The Special Forces Association
for themselves.
They have a great job of beating the hallways in Congress and having people lobby on them for there and everything else. And so I applaud them. I would love to have that capability so that we could fight some of this back. But at this point, it really does take me reaching out to people to call the congressman to even have the congressman ask harder questions than beyond the press releases.
Right.
Because the press releases always sound great. I mean, that's what public affairs does. I mean, they do a great job. and so
would you like some more Kool-Aid with that?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think it was like on the 9th of November, General Ferguson released an email talking about the move of the civil affairs and SIOP battalions underneath the SF groups. And he was talking about, well, in my 20 years associated with this command, we've lacked the integration, and this is going to improve the integration and all that stuff. And I'm reading this going, yes, it will improve integration at the tactical level only. It actually goes, even though they got the idea for this from the RAND study itself gave some pretty dire warnings about the consequences of this.
Right.
But if you just read the email as a public release, you're like, oh, yeah, this is awesome. Why wouldn't you do this? Why didn't we do this 30 years ago?
Right.
And it's because they're good at what they do. Mm-hmm. And so being able to find our alumni force or other, congressmen or other people who are in a position to say, okay, this force is actually listed by name in the National Security Council and in the National Defense Authorization Act.
Right.
And so if you're going to make major changes, you should be briefing us on what the impact of these changes are going to be to their ability to achieve the missions that we've given them in these public documents.
Right.
And we don't have anybody asking that question. So if you're a reporter or a congressman or anybody else and you got a copy of that email, you'd just be like, oh, yeah, makes sense. Okay,
that's cool. Yeah, that's smart. We're going to become more efficient.
Yeah, because nobody knows how to ask the second and third order question of, well, what's the impact of this? And is there a detriment to our national security as a result, which I believe that there is. I don't think we can achieve all the missions assigned to us in the NDAA once we make these moves. But, that's just me.
Okay. Well, I'm going to cut it there. We have hit a solid hour of conversation, and I've got to run. But I think that this is going to be a really easy episode to cut and put together.
Cool. We'll go from there, but I enjoyed the conversation, Jack. I really did.
Yeah, I always have a good time talking to you. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you're interested in coming on the show or hosting an episode, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com. And now, most importantly, to those currently out in the field, working with a partner nation's people or leadership to forward U.S. relations, thank you all for what you're doing. This is Jack, your host. Stay tuned for more great episodes. 1CA Podcast.